Hi there, this is a Serial Cynic. It's been quite some time since I've last done a video, and here I am to do another one. The last few videos I did not involve you seeing my face or me here doing any talking where you can see me. But I'm back. It's been some time. So, wanted to get to a topic that actually, I had been thinking about this for quite some time, but believe it or not, it has something to do with the Hebrew Israelites. I know a lot of my videos have been about them, and I'm going to do another one about them after this video. But while I was researching claims that they make, I came across some information that I'm sure a lot of you out there already know. But I don't know if there's a lot of people who've considered this or thought about it in this way. Now, I'm not looking at my details right now. My computer's behind me. I'm not looking at my details, but one of the things that I think a lot of us are aware of, I would hope we're aware of it by now, is that let's use England, for example, that they brought slavery in their empire, that is, their empire from back in the 1800s, 1700s, going further back. But they brought slavery to an end in their empire, I think in 1834, if I'm not mistaken. Now, the slave trade, trading in slaves had ended prior to that. But slavery itself, they abolished in, I believe, 1834, somewhere about there. Other European countries followed not long after. I think France was in the 1840s, even though France had abolished slavery back during the Haitian Revolution, and then they reinstated it, which is kind of like why the Haitian Revolution went on the way that it did. But the British ended slavery in 1834. And after they did that, because they were the most powerful empire at the time, at least in Europe, they were the most powerful empire, they lobbied for the other colonial powers to also end slavery in their colonies, the French, the Dutch, and of course the Spanish. And they soon followed suit. So to show that England was serious about what they were doing, and even prior to them ending slavery, but to show that they were serious about, what they said, they started sending ships off the coast of Africa to guard the coast, so to speak, to watch out for those breaking the law, still trying to engage in smuggling slaves or enslaved Africans out of Africa and across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. Later on, the United States themselves got involved, but of course, they ended slavery long after the British. But they eventually became a part of this also, blockading and trying to prevent ships from leaving Africa with enslaved Africans. But the British, in doing so, sorry about the camera there blurring ice because I moved my head. But the British, in doing so, they began patrolling the waters off Western Africa, looking out for ships, trying to sneak out in the cover of night with enslaved Africans and so forth. But here is where the irony of all this comes in, and you may not understand or may not have thought about how colonialism in Africa came about as a result because of this very act that the British were doing in trying to prevent slave ships from leaving Africa with enslaved Africans. Believe it or not, there's actually a connection. It wasn't planned out to be this way, I'm sure, but it just happened to evolve into something else. And how did this happen? So as the British began patrolling off the coast of Western Africa, they would capture these ships carrying a cargo of Africans. They will then fine or imprison or punish the slave drivers, those carrying the cargo on their ships. They would confiscate the ships. Then they would take the Africans off the ships and resettle them back on the continent of Africa in places like what has become known as Sierra Leone. Of course, the Americans eventually did that with Liberia. But the British would go ahead and resettle these captured people, probably not knowing where they came from originally, where their port of embarkation was. So they would just simply go ahead and take them and just resell them somewhere back on the continent, on the coast somewhere. So in doing this, it expanded the influence of the British on the coastline. So the British now started to have more and more ships, started to patrol more and more waters, and eventually they started setting up bases and offices on the coastline of Africa in places like what we would call Nigeria today. So they started setting up these bases and these camps and so forth in those areas. So by setting up these camps, now they're no longer out in the water. And here's another thing you have to keep in mind, that when slavery was going on, the Europeans never really used to get off their boats and get on land and go into the interior and grab Africans and enslave them. That was not what they did. Now they built forts on the coastline. They hung out on the coastline. Their offices and their bases were on the coastline. And they enlisted the help of local Africans to go into the interior to capture rival African tribes and bring them in shackles or in chains or whatever, and bring them to the coastline. And then the Europeans would lock them away in forts until the ships came in, and then put them on the ships and then send them across the seas to the Americas. But now it was a little bit different, or something similar. But now the British were there, supposedly policing the area, making sure that slave raiding, slave trading, and slave shipment came to an end. So while they were there doing this, they started to encroach more and more into the land itself. Now, the interesting thing is, next door, so we have the area known as Nigeria today, but next door, there was a kingdom known as Porto Novo, which in Portuguese, which in English, that's Portuguese, but in English means new port. Now the British, looking over there at Porto Novo, which was like one of the big slave trading centers, they looked over and it's like, hey, they're doing over there what we're trying to stop. Now, that was not under the British jurisdiction to go over there and tell the local people what they should and should not do on their own land. And this caused some tension. So the British now, looking like the moral police, is saying, wow, those people over there doing a lot of bad things, trading in slaves, which is something the British had done for hundreds of years prior. And the British turned around and was like, we're going to stop that. The local people, on the other hand, the local Africans, who, I'm not, again, as I said in a previous video, I'm not saying all Africans were involved in slavery or trading in slaves and so forth, but you did have some. You did have some kings, you did have some areas, you did have some tribes that were in on that because they were making lots of money, great wealth they received from this. And one of these places was in Porto Novo, which is currently the capital of the country of Benin. So the British looked over and bombarded the area to stop the slave trading from going on. The people in Porto Novo looked around, realizing they were completely outmanned and outgunned when it came to the British, with the British having superior firepower. So the people of Porto Novo turned to a rival of the British, the French, and said, hey guys, we need your help to stop these British people over here from bothering us. So they enlisted the help of the French. Meanwhile, next door now to Porto Novo, you had the kingdom of Dahomey. And the people in Dahomey, who were also engaged in slave trading, they looked over and saw the French next door. They looked over and saw the French next door, and the French looked over and saw the British next door. So the people in Dahomey, realizing that the French, who were also now on that same tip of we don't believe in slave trading, we don't believe in slavery, they looked at the French as being a threat to their livelihood, which was in great part slave trading and slave raiding. So as a result, the people from Dahomey, or the king of Dahomey, the last king, I forgot his name, I don't know if I can pronounce it, it begins with a B, but he went on the offensive. And he still went down into areas like in Porto Novo, slave raiding and so forth. And the French were like, hey, we're controlling the city now. What are you doing down here doing this? We're not going to tolerate that. And eventually, war broke out. And because the war broke out, the French, of course, defeated the people, the kingdom of Dahomey. And in doing so, their influence began to spread until what we call Benin today was basically completely under French control. Meanwhile, over in Nigeria, the British eventually took over that whole landscape, that whole land area. And in doing so, they then exerted their influence over the region. Now, what this did, it basically set the stage for the colonization, or as the Europeans call it, the race for Africa. So what started out as something seemingly benevolent, which was, hey, we're going to go down there and stop slavery. We're going to go down there and stop the slave trading. We're going to be the good guys now. And we're going to go down there and teach these people to stop doing that, because we've stopped. So we're going to get them to stop doing that. And in the course of getting them to stop doing that, this brought them into contention with some local African tribes, some local African kings who wanted to continue to practice because it brought money in. And the tension now between the bad guys, the local Africans, and the good guys, the Europeans, led to a more aggressive approach and aggressive colonization of the area to stamp their influence down, the British that is, and the French, to stamp their influence in the area, to basically put their agenda over on the local people. And in doing so, they got their foot in the door, and before you know it, they got the yard, and before you know it, they had the whole country, or tons of tribes under their control. And thus began colonization in Africa. And sure enough, followed by the French and the British, then the folks from Belgium came in, Germany came in, a few other European countries, I can't recall them right now, they popped in. And before you know it, the Europeans were all over Africa, in the race for Africa. So again, the irony to all of this is something that started out as something benevolent, to stop a human injustice, slavery. Even though the British, the French, the Spanish, even though they were involved in it for hundreds of years and benefited, when it came to a point where it was not economically viable anymore, because, sugar is what drove a lot of slavery, at least in the Caribbean region. When it was not lucrative anymore, then it was like, we're going to go down there and cut this out right now. Leading to tensions between the local folks and the Europeans, which now basically set up the stage for wars, set up the stage for justification to go further in, deeper in, get more involved. And then that paved the way for future colonization of Africa. So it's an ironic thing, but it's really an interesting story. Really, really interesting when you can put the two together and see how one thing led to the other. Anyway, in case you didn't know, you can look it up, think it over. You can drop some comments down below. Tell me what you think about what my thoughts were. Tell me if you think I'm way off. I know I'm not way off, actually. I know I am pretty much right, but maybe my details may not be accurate, or maybe there are things I'm not including, And of course, it's a very, very complex topic, and there's a whole lot of other factors involved that I did not even touch. But if you can think of anything else, if you want to add anything else, feel free to post them down in the comments, okay? All right, I'm going to move on to this other video about the Hebrew Israelites here in a minute. Again, not my kick bag, so to speak, but they're interesting. And they force you to think of some things, you know? So I'll see if I can get to that video in a minute, all right? Anyway, you guys enjoyed this video. You can share it, like it, but most importantly, I wouldn't mind if you guys come down there and we can have a discussion about this. You can elaborate. You can say more things. Whatever the case might be, I would really appreciate it, okay? Subscribe also. I would like you to do that. Share it with your friends and ask them to subscribe. All right? You guys take care. Until the next video. Here's your Serial Cynic checking out.